Next, I have the privilege of moderating our final and, dare say, most exciting panel of the day. So I'm going to invite my colleagues, my panelists here to sit with me. Throughout the day, the topic of AI, quantum, and stablecoin came up over and over and over again. So I think that it's kind of fitting that we're closing the session today with experts that have been helping us develop these files over the years. And it's really great to have all three of you here. While you might not, you'll know me as your trusty MC. I've been a leader in the technology field for the last 35 years, working for IBM, Bell, Capgemini, and I've been working on the cyber and tech risk file at GRI since 2019. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, and I'll start with Michele Mosca, who's here beside me. Michele is the CEO and founder of evolutionQ, which is a world-leading expert in quantum computing and cybersecurity. Thanks to GRI's 10-year partnership with Michele, we've been able to give our members unique access to their cutting-edge thinking and research. Michele has been instrumental in working globally with industry and governments to advance the imperative of preparing digital infrastructures to be resilient against quantum-enabled adversaries. Welcome, Michele. Agostino Capponi, who's in the middle seat, is a professor at Columbia University, where he's also the founding director of the Columbia Center for Digital Finance and Technologies. Again, GRI's 10-year partnership with Agostino, including our three-year partnership with the Columbia Center for Digital Finance and Technologies, allows us to share his pioneering work in digital finance directly with you. And finally, Cameron Schuler. Cameron is the Chief Commercialization Officer and Vice President Industry Innovation at the Vector Institute, and formerly led one of the world's top AI and machine learning groups at AMI. He brings an extensive career in a variety of industries, combining both the business and technology aspects of business development. The Vector Institute has contributed as a participant in the GRI Financial Institutions Forum on Artificial Intelligence. So welcome to all of you. And I'm going to ask each panelist to give the audience a brief description of their area of expertise, the current developments, the implications for the financial services sector, and then we'll proceed to a discussion. As a reminder, go into the CVent app and send us your questions, and we'll be happy to answer all of them, or as many of them as we can. I know you may have some questions. I mean, this topic came up over and over today, so it'll be interesting to get it from the experts, their views on these things. So Michele, I'll ask you to start with quantum computing and where we are today.
Yeah. So my early area of expertise was trying to break codes. So I had the fun job of, just as we were starting to use public key methods to protect the internet, when banks and others decided to use it as a tool, I thought, well, I'm going to try to break them. And then I learned about quantum computing by accident. I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard of. And then sort of rapidly went through Schopenhauer's 3 phases of reject, violently oppose, and then accept as self-evident. So I've just by fluke been at the nexus of quantum computing, like what it is, how to build it, how to apply it, and so on. So that's one area. And I'm an expert also on how we use cryptography and also cryptographic risk. So how these two things collide. So that's kind of where my main specialty, what I'm most known for worldwide. And where are we now? Quantum computing went from something I ridiculed and thought was science fiction, and then in '96 I said, because obviously, as you may have heard, one of the reasons we know there's this immense power in quantum computing is because it can break those codes I'd been trying to break so hard in the early '90s, but it can break them really fast. It goes from secure to completely broken. That's not a good situation. So we know they're super powerful. But in '96, I said, this is not going to happen for the next 20 years. And then I said a few years later, well, maybe a 1% chance in 20 years. Maybe a 20. Now it's over 80% chance, and I don't even talk about 20 years. I think the chance of this happening is probably 10 to 20%. My last official estimates have been 10%, but it's going to be higher when I update them in 5 years, and over 30% in 10 years. So is that bad? Yes, because cryptography, in the 80s, it was protecting some secrets, state secrets. There was a tradecraft of manually exchanging keys and slight generalizations of that. To now, with public key methodologies and so on, it's protecting pretty much every aspect of our lives, as you know, not just secrets. It's not just about protecting some PII. It's about authenticating and the integrity of information. So this means your entire supply chains are vulnerable to adversaries taking over those solutions, pretending to be your suppliers. Right? That's bad. So you're talking about, again, the integrity of ledgers, the availability of systems, the control of connected devices. It's all underpinned. All the zero trust stuff we talk about, it's zero trust as long as the cryptography isn't broken. And if the cryptography is broken, people don't even know, right? It goes from not a big deal to, oh, well, then we're all going to die anyway. So, and part of what I'm trying to do is, can we zero in on that little nanosecond gap between, I got bigger things, more important things to worry about too. Well, if that happens, we're all going to die anyway. Because I think there's a lot of room there if we zoom in, and we can actually prevent these global catastrophes. So I think what I'm realizing, there's lack of visibility in how cryptographic risk, as I'm calling it, isn't yet another weird technology risk. It's actually an amplifier of most of your enterprise risk, including vendor concentration risk and supply chain. And if we really assessed how it changes our risk profile, it's at an unacceptable level now, right? But we have instruments for bringing it down to an acceptable level. So apart from following the quantum capabilities and possibilities, understanding how it correlates to cryptographic and enterprise risk more generally, we're also working very hard on very pragmatic, scalable ways to bring those risks down to an acceptable level. So I think we do need, I guess, one of the main messages I'm trying to drive home with people is we're not playing 1990s baseball anymore or hockey anymore, right? The game has changed. It's hyper fast, hyper scale. We have AI and quantum. Forget about the slow motion whack-a-mole with cryptographic adversaries, because that's how we've been doing it for centuries. And we need to snap out of that and realize that's not going to work. We need to switch to a resilience mindset. So the bullets aren't going to be slow motion rubber bullets. They're super fast, very dangerous bullets, and they're going to come faster and faster, so you're not going to see them and dodge them. You need a shield. And you don't just need one shield, because people are going to figure out how to get through that one. You need two. You need defense in depth. Again, the technology people can solve these problems. We know how to do it scalably. The main gap is nobody's asking us to. Or as Peter mentioned earlier, I think they say, oh wait, but that metal for the shield, we could use that for something else. Yeah, but then you don't have a shield. All right, then you're playing hockey without padding. Not fun, right? You're not going to play your best hockey. It's very dangerous. So we really do need this resilience mindset, and we know how to do it. And anyway, looking forward to talking about this more with my distinguished colleagues.
Thanks, Michele. So we started the day off by being depressed by Gary, and so now Michele has told us the world's going to end also from cryptography. Well, we'll try to be more optimistic as we move across the group. Agostino, tell us a little bit about the stablecoins. We heard about stablecoins today. They got mentioned. You've done some work in that. You can tell us a little bit more, and especially since coming from the United States, you have a little bit more visibility into what's being done there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me first start saying that my journey into crypto actually started with understanding how to design better marketplaces on blockchain. So how can we design better decentralized exchanges? How can we design better insurance services, lending and borrowing protocols? And I think there has always been a challenge in a way to the crypto finance that is deployed on blockchain, and the challenge has always been, okay, why is it useful? Like, what does it add to our current financial system? Why aren't we happy with just like using traditional banking services, insurance services? Why do we need to create the digital equivalent of currencies or dollars and so on? And I think the answer, one of the answers to this question is exactly like stable coins. I believe stable coins as well, which is, in my view, a form of tokenized assets. You essentially tokenize fiat currencies. In the case of the US stable coins, you tokenize the dollar. You create a digital representation of this dollar, and then you can send it over the internet in a way. And I mean, of course, the question is that creating this digital representation of the dollar or of any other fiat currency, could be of a euro, it could be of Australian dollars or Canadian dollars and so on, comes with its own challenges, because I think what is important is then to specify or to clarify what it means to have this digital representation, to have somewhat a fiat currency which is digitalized and is living on a blockchain or a distributed ledger. And then depending on how you maintain this relation with the dollar, you have different types of stable coins, right? We have fiat-backed stable coins, which essentially are the equivalent representation of a dollar in the sense that once you buy one of the stable coin, then you deposit like physical dollar, and then this dollar will be invested or will be kept in reserves by the company which is issuing the stable coins. So depending on how they maintain these reserves, they will ensure more or less stability. So if they invest these reserves that they get from users who buy the stable coin in very risky assets, then there will be, of course, a risk that you may not get back your stable coin. You may not be able to redeem the stable coin if you want to. And of course, the question, I mean, in fact, I think the term stable is a little bit abused in the sense that what does it mean to be stable, right? So not all crypto coins that we currently call stable coins are stable. In fact, I mean, some of them, in my view, are unstable. The ones that are backed by, let's say, cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin or Ethereum, they are subject to a large volatility, and as a result, meaning stability is a question that needs to be defined. And I think that's where the Genius Act, which was recently passed in the United States in July 2025, and I've been following these developments very closely because one of the person that was in charge of like discussing with the Securities and Exchange Commission about the regulation of stablecoins happened to be one of my co-authors on one of the papers that we were working on stablecoins, and I think one of the main I would say, findings of those discussions that was then put formally into the Genius Act was to specify exactly what it means to have a stable coin, like what type of assets you are allowed to use if you want to maintain the stability. So you can use only treasury or cash equivalent, precisely because these are deemed to be very safe assets, very stable, not subject to a lot of market volatility. And also they focus on consumer protection, right? If I buy the stable coin, then I can be safe that if I want to redeem stable coins, I will basically be able to do that. So it's like as if I really hold a physical dollar in my pocket. And in fact, I think this emphasis on consumer protection, which essentially also makes the consumers to be the primary creditors in the sense that if the company which is issuing the stable coins defaults, then the first creditors that will be cashed back or paid back are precisely the customers, the consumers, right? And this, I think, paves the way for like a broader adoption, because now these stable coins can be classified as payment securities. You can use them to make payments. You can use them not only for buying other crypto tokens, which was mostly the use of stable coins prior to the Genius Act. Primarily, they were used, for example, to buy an Ethereum, to buy a Bitcoin, or to buy any other cryptocurrency, or to conduct some arbitrage on decentralized exchanges, which of course was mostly for speculative reasons, but not for remittances, not for payments. And I think in my view, this opens also paves the way also for issuing stable coins, which are not necessarily fiat-backed stable coins. For example, I foresee that in the next few years there will be social media companies such as Amazon, Walmart. There has been already discussion about it, issuing their own stable coin, right? They issue their own version of the coin, which of course can bring a lot of benefits to this company in terms of reducing the fees that typically they have to pay to the credit card companies, or the interchange fees that they have to pay in case they are actually not using the credit card, but they're using some other service, such as their own Amazon or Google card and so on. And I believe that this could be a game changer, because I can see that it could be mutually beneficial both for the company in terms of bringing up the revenues, and also in terms of the consumers, because of course they might get some discount or loyalty like benefits if they use like the so-called version of the stable coin issued by the company. And I think that these companies have a lot of infrastructure in place, a lot of technology already set up, being big data providers, and they also have a large customer base. So for them, it wouldn't be that difficult to issue a stable coin, which would be broadly adopted and used in transactions. And I'm looking forward to seeing more about it.
Yeah. Thank you, Agostino. I think so the third leg of our stool today that we've been discussing on the emerging technologies is AI, and we've heard it all day long. So Cameron, I think over to you. I think your views on adoption, risk management. I mean, there's been a lot discussed today on AI, so I'll let you say a few minutes around the topic, and then we're going to circle back and make the linkages between all the emerging technologies.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me here. This has been great for the parts I was able to participate in. So I want to start out with a little bit of history of AI. Earlier you heard Gary talk about Alan Turing, as we mentioned. And Alan Turing died about 70 years ago, is considered the father of the field. And you being in Canada is an incredible advantage that you may not be aware of. So I got in the field in 2008. It was considered to be a dead field, had zero commercial value, so I thought this is a fantastic place to go advance my career. But it turns out sometimes good fortune smiles on you, and it's turned out fairly well for me. But we toiled in obscurity for, even after I got in the field, for roughly 5 years. Nobody cared about it. And then in 2012, Jeff Hinton and a couple of his students here at University of Toronto did something that changed the world. So AI historically has been very brittle and hard to work with. But all of a sudden, compute caught up and data caught up, and there was a new methodology that came out called deep learning, and it had value. So all of a sudden the world changed dramatically. And we have these fairly large step changes. So when I say AI or machine learning, I mean the same thing. So humans forever have been trying to forecast the future. I don't care if it's throwing chicken bones or reading tea leaves, they want to know what the future holds. Well, we do that with data. You use historical data to train a model to help you forecast what the future might look like. So deep learning was an incredible advance. But when you think about the simplicity of how AI works, it is a system that is able to observe and learn from experience. And that's really what AI is. They're learning systems. So don't get caught up in ChatGPT is AI. It's a form of AI, Gemini and other things like that. So let's fast forward now where computers still forced people to work the way they worked, as the way computers worked. And then in 2022, ChatGPT came out, and it really was a change. You could interact with the computer and get it to do things in a manner that we're very accustomed to speaking and very accustomed to interacting. And that was a huge change for everybody. So these are incredibly large models. They use lots of data. And they don't use the whole universe of data in the world, but they use the whole universe of public data in the world to then be able to forecast or predict what's going to happen next. So we think that's incredibly valuable, it's incredibly important, and if you ever interacted with any ChatGPT, Gemini, or any of the other systems, you'll have found that it does some pretty interesting things. If you haven't used it, please do. And if you think people inside your organization are not using it, they absolutely are. And a lot of companies have set that up. But ultimately, when you start thinking about the opportunities for AI, it really is, it provides the ability to leverage human abilities. That's the short version of it. So at Vector, what we do, because a number of our partners are here, is we help companies accelerate AI adoption. And they've really sunk their teeth into that. It's also important to note that Canada's 5 largest banks are global leaders. They are in the top 25 in the world for AI adoption, with 2 of them being in the top 10. And ultimately, that's because of the ecosystem in which they participate. But as you might imagine, there's potential for risk in that. And I think I can probably stop there, and we can go into some of the other questions.
Yeah, well, let's start by exploring the intersection, because we heard about it today when we had the, if you were here for the breakout panel in the main plenary, they did start talking about the intersection between some of these emerging technologies. You mentioned the computing power got there to help us develop the AI level that we have today. Let's start with you and the computing power that we might have with quantum computers. And what will that do to the ability of AI to continue its learning journey?
Yeah, so as Michele said, it's fairly early in the journey, and he'll probably rescue me with some of these answers too, by the way. But when you think about the amount of data to deal with, quantum will take a long time to be able to deal with large amounts of data. It's going to be pretty specialized. But the ability of AI to help direct quantum and things like that are going to be pretty incredible. And that's where the intersection is. So there's no, when I say there's no natural intersection, there is, but they're very different things, and it's how can you leverage each to get the best out of both. And I think that's really where the world's going to look differently. But we still don't even have fault-tolerant quantum computing yet either, and there's a bit of a challenge around that. But again, these are problems to be solved, and I think when it comes to how they're going to interact together, there will be great power for very specific things.
Do you feel AI is going to help develop quantum computers?
And I think, Cameron touched upon the two main areas where I think AI will accelerate quantum computing. And that's why quantum strategy is an essential part of an AI strategy, not something you think about later. So on what do we do with, analyzing big amounts of data? That's probably not what quantum computers are good for. But if AI or something else can distill it down to a small data, large compute problem, that's when quantum could really, together with AI, really solve some problems. And just to back, so it's not about ending the world, because why can AI help? Quantum mechanics was invented because there were some macroscopically observable physical phenomena that looked impossible. So why are these impossible things happening? So we invented a new theory of physics that suddenly these impossible things, we realize why they're possible. There's some extra knobs and rules of physics we didn't know existed before. But over the last century, we developed technologies that can actually control those knobs. We can actually control quantum phenomena, and we can engineer previously impossible things to become possible, such as breaking these codes, or measuring things with a precision we thought was impossible, and that maybe will transform energy, right? And of course, impact the Canadian and other economies. Or we can design codes with security properties previously we thought were impossible. So we're very excited. It's really a positive story. We want to enable it. But with any truly new capability, people are kind of looking at it and saying, well, how am I going to use this? Even blockchain and other things. Yeah, that's nice, but how are we going to use it? And AI, for one, it'd be a great tool for finding those use cases and accelerating those applications. Secondly, AI can accelerate. We've just in the last 12 to 18 months, and I've been predicting this for a long time and saying this is going to happen on these timescales. Now we're clearly in the era of fault-tolerant quantum computing, right? We're not yet where we want to be to the point where we can break these codes and do many other things, but now it's a small number of years away. So we've demonstrated, we've validated the hypothesis, right? And now we're really building scalable systems to implement large-scale versions of this. So we're really in this scaling phase so we can fully and scalably correct these errors. And AI can help us all along the way in designing better ways to correct the errors, design the systems, compile the algorithms, and I already mentioned maybe find the algorithms in the use cases. So it's a great accelerator of what we're trying to do, and that's super exciting. So to me, it's a win-win. And guess what? Canada's been a world leader in both of these areas for a long, long time. And on the flip side, the part that I think, my AI friends sometimes roll their eyes is because sometimes people think, and then quantum is going to somehow supercharge AI and we're going to do all these amazing things even more. Maybe. That's one of the use cases. Actually, there's an array of use cases. There's a lot of really clever algorithmics that goes into AI. And part of how we harness and find the value of quantum computing is to develop a funnel of potential applications and really start triaging and studying them, and some of them turn out to be short-term wins and so on. And accelerating AI is one of the suite of problems we should look at. I think one low-hanging fruit place to start is quantum systems are really good at training AI to solve quantum problems, right? Tactically, start there, because sure, is it going to general purpose help you with everything else? Probably not. But once you have those first few wins, then you could say, but wait a minute, are there some other interesting problems that are close to these quantum problems, but in some other sector? and you start, you land and expand sort of thing. So I think there's many really positive synergies. And like Cameron said, we're blessed in Canada. We have world leaders in both of these things. So it's really our opportunity to lose. And we're, of course, really excited to seize these opportunities together.
Maybe springboarding off of a question I received from the audience. We talked about if quantum computing can one day crack every possible password, let's say the cryptography, how can banks prepare to stay ahead of that risk? Let's twist that a little bit and just talk about how the financial sector can stay ahead of the use of getting ready for quantum computers, getting ahead of continuing to deploy AI, for its use and making sure that it's leveraged for the institutions. And then we'll talk about the crypto and stablecoin, but primarily stablecoin environment. So why don't we touch on quantum first, and I'll go over to Cameron, and then we'll talk about.
So it won't break every code we have, just the ones we're using, right? So it'll break, and not all the ones we're using. So those symmetric key infrastructures we've been using since Julius Caesar, those are just weakened, and that's slow motion. We know how to deal with that. So that I'm not so worried about. We use longer keys and so on. It's the public key infrastructures though that go from they're fine to they're not fine all of a sudden. Our immune system is not ready for that. So, but we actually know we know how to deal with that. It's really simple. You have diversity, but I don't mean a 20 weird ad hoc mediocre methods, but 2 or 3 different methodologies. It's how did you deal with the authentication problem and the fact that passwords are never going to be perfect. We went to MFA. So it's not, this is really simple. Have 2 very different ways to achieve the same objectives, layer at least, again, in a risk-based fashion, because you don't do MFA everywhere, that'd be annoying. You do it where it really matters, and you can even be MFA ready, and you kind of turn it on when you really, but we need to have those 2 or more, I'd say 3 is probably 2 to 3 different ways, 2 different ecosystems, different infrastructures for establishing and managing keys. And then in a risk-based fashion, you deploy the right number of factors, right? And we just keep rolling. Those are the 2 shields I was talking about. Then don't be afraid. We're not all going to die. We're fine. We have 2 layers. They're both really, really good. If AI, together with quantum and who knows what, pierces one of them, we're going to scramble, but we'll do it. We'll get over it, and we'll continue. So we'll be able to, because we'll be able to boldly harness and create all the value that AI and quantum and everything else enables, and all the hyperscale and hyperspeed enables, and know that if because adversaries are going to weaponize the same capabilities, right? But actually, a defense actually has an advantage here if we're smart about it, and we architect with this defense in depth posture in mind. So I'm not worried. We just need the mandate to create that resilience, and that's currently missing in the way we currently govern risk. So, but if we get, but that's part of risk. But if we can, this cryptographic risk is still not understood well enough, and it's largely our fault in how we communicate and talk about it. But I think it's a really easy fix, and once we have the mandate, we can definitely architect for cryptographic resilience.
So Cameron, how about the risks of adopting or not adopting AI? Because we'll look at 2 sides of that coin today.
Yeah, so it's a good question. But first, I have a question for the audience. What is Canada good at? Just shout it out.
Hockey.
That's definitely the number 1 thing I hear. And I've asked this to audiences of thousands of people at a time. So hockey is definitely one of them. But as Canadians, we tend to be uncomfortable with saying we're fantastic at things. We don't stand up and boast about Canadians are awesome at everything. We're not, but many things we are, right? Third country to put a satellite into orbit. If you need an organ transplant, you should be here. There's all these things that as Canadians, we are excellent at and we don't know, right? Did you know we're one of the best in the world in quantum? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But ultimately, even on the AI side, right? We've been excellent at AI for decades, but nobody knew that. So the reason I bring that up is we generally tend to be conservative in nature. And ultimately, the biggest risk is not adopting AI. That is by far the biggest one. So PwC, who's a partner of ours, and we're grateful for that, does a CEO survey every year. 35% of Canadian CEOs say that they think their company may not be relevant in the next 10 years. You take your ball and go home? Of course not. You have to do something about it. And it's really going to be the technological change that is going to drive that. And so ultimately, we're thrilled that the banks are some of the best adopters in the world. And we do think technology is moving fast right now, but I will say the very first pacemaker that was implanted into a human that was self-contained was developed in a bicycle shop and implanted 3 weeks later. So we do have a history in the world of adopting technology fairly quickly, but it feels really fast right now. And so ultimately it's that optimization problem between how much risk are you willing to accept and what are the risks of not actually doing it. And right now there's a complete imbalance of not actually being able to do the things you need to do in business to make you more efficient and make you more effective. So ultimately, that's something everyone has to be doing, and all businesses of all sizes across Canada, they're going to be left behind. Catching up is not a real thing.
Great. Agostino, I have a question here for you. I'm going to ask it directly. I know the person who asked it here. I have not seen a credible use of case for stablecoins, where the use of stablecoins are demonstratively better than traditional currency with digital transfer. What am I missing?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting provocative question. I mean, I've heard similar questions in the past, especially when you think about crypto securities. Meaning, if you think about the fundamental function of a stable coin, right? What is that? It's essentially, it seems on the surface like an alternative to deposit. Instead of depositing money at the bank, or instead of depositing at the central bank, you deposit money to a private corporation if this is if the stablecoin is issued by a private company, which is the case for most of the stablecoins. And then you're essentially given this digital token that you can transact on the blockchain. So on the surface, it is like you say, okay, why aren't we happy already with the banks? I say they are. Why? What the stablecoin issuers do is they take your money and then they invest it in very safe assets, either in treasury or maybe in money market funds, and they gain some interest from that, and then they pay you back. If you redeem the stablecoin, they give you back the money without interest. So it seems that it's even worse than going to a bank and deposit this money. But then if you think about other possibility, for example, like one of the uses that I think is very strong for stablecoin is that they allow you to make payments on the blockchain 24 hours, 7 days a week, right? So if you have to perform some operations and you have to post deposits or making a margin call and you cannot get access to liquidity because some of the markets are closed, you can do that with a stable coin, right? There is also the question that if you want to transact, you can use them, okay, you can redeem the stable coins, get back your physical dollars, but if you want to operate in the larger blockchain ecosystem, that's the only way that you can do it, is basically to have a digital asset, and stablecoin will be a digital asset. Meaning, another way is that the stable coins, if they are properly designed, in the sense that they're really stable and they give you safety, then they could be basically a very valid alternative, as I mentioned earlier, to, for example, using other form of private money, but even using like dollars, euros, if you want to be somewhat unexposed to all the risks coming from inflation or other macroeconomic consequences in different countries, you will be insulated against it, right? And also I want to make another case that if you think about, okay, maybe developed economies such as Canada, US, perhaps Australia and Europe, maybe you would say, okay, these are advantages, but maybe they're not strong enough. There is still a setup cost because you have to develop your technology. But if you think about emerging market economies, right, where their monetary system somehow is weak or it's not well developed, there is very limited price discovery. I think if this country starts adopting stable coins as an alternative, for example, to their domestic currency, so in this case it would be a use of stable coin as a legal tender, that would be actually a way to avoid exposure, for example, to dollars or euro, instead of using the US dollar, which is what has been done in many cases prior to the advent of stable coin. you could use a stable coin, right, as a digital form of assets. So I think these are all, like, in my view, very good uses of stablecoin. And even connected to AI, I can foresee that in the near future, if we start adopting the AI services more and more, it could be actually a way to pay for an AI service. If you need to get data, if you need to run, like, you need a lot of GPUs to execute your computation. You need to buy tokens, for example, to run your AI service. Maybe you could use stable coins. Like, they give you a stable source of money, and again, you can reduce substantially the fees because you don't have to pay substantial fees to any private credit card company. So I can see another very convincing use of stable coins.
All right, great. So Cameron, I'm going to start with you on this question, and then I'm going to go to Michele. So if you were the CEO of a bank and had $200 million, it said 100, but I've doubled it because I wanted to make it more significant. To invest in AI quantum, how much would you put into defensive uses? How much would you go into business growth uses? And I'm going to add another section, investment. So, like...
So when you say investment, you mean infrastructure investment?
No, I mean investment.
The capital markets.
Capital markets or investment. In other words, making sure that you're getting a good return in that. And you talked a little bit about that.
What's that?
We won't quote you.
So Janet's on the board of Vector, so... Yeah, so when I think about these areas, so I'm actually going to pull from a Volkswagen on the quantum side. So 8 or 9 years ago, we were speaking with them, and they said, "Oh, we're really interested in quantum." And they're like, "Well, do you think it's going to be real?" I don't mean to offend you, by the way, but do you think it's going to be real? And they said, "We don't actually care. If it is, we need to be there." Right? And so that's one of the keys in all of this. You need to be prepared when things arrive. In terms of that dollar amount, it would really depend on objectives, right? And so I think professionally, I come from a capital markets background, so why wouldn't you put it all there? But I think when I look at the objectives of the organization, what are you trying to accomplish? So I don't know if I can come up with a good ratio on that. But ultimately, so Vector was founded to ensure that Canadian organizations have the talent they need to succeed. It's pretty straightforward. And that still matters, but about 2.5 years ago, we started to hear change management. It was really, really important. What does that mean? People worried about their jobs. So ultimately, I'd invest a lot of that amount in getting people up and running on it, getting people with the ability to change their own workflows, the ability to engage it in the way they work in a safe manner that's not going to cause you any issues. But that's probably where I'd actually invest most of it, in terms of how can you reinvent what you do. Because I do think that having that ownership and having that self-determination is incredibly important. So probably almost all of it would go into that, making sure that it is available to your employees to actually make your organization more efficient. Because I can tell you with my staff, if somebody says, how does your team work? And they go ask them how it works, it's probably going to look a little bit different, right? So the people on the ground are the ones that can really influence it.
Okay, Michele?
I love the question. So it's 200 million per year, right? So, and I think it's time. It's time dependent. So initially, it's 80% defense and 20% offense. So you gotta, because first of all, we don't yet know what the applications are, so we don't need to spend a lot of money on the hardware and all that. It's really, and I'll explain a little bit what I would do with the offense side. But the defense, there's like a 10% chance or more that in 5 years, it's going to be a mad rush to just defend against the known threats, let alone create the resilience. So in the very short term, we have to create a safe and strong foundation to really play exciting offense and score a ton of goals. But you have to be able to boldly and aggressively and assertively do that, and not just taking pucks to the face, because then you're going to be unconscious and you're not going to score a lot of goals. So in the short term, we got to bolster our defense. But then the whole point of this is to have a strong offense. And I think in a small number of years, it'll be reversed. And we can maintain that resilience and so on with 20%, like a small fraction. Okay, now, and then it'll be 80% offense. And how will that offense grow? With that initial small but growing bucket of offense, again, figure out the use cases, right? Figure out how they work. With any innovation, the first thing you do is you say, well, how can I speed up? How can I improve what I'm currently doing? And you'll come up with some small wins, and then you'll kind of reinvent and reimagine and so on. So there's going to be that evolution, right? And then while I'm going through that, then that 80-20, then I would start splitting that up into, then you'll know what the hell you're doing in terms of where should I be investing, right? Because initially you can talk to these people, all these talking heads who don't know what they're talking about and make a lot of really bad bets. But I think the best way to have a clue is to do something. So I think, so it's a stage strategy, but again, 80% defense, 20% offense. Initially, as ASAP transition to the reverse and the offense side, initially start doing things, find those use cases, and then as you start finding the wins, then you'll be investing in capitalizing on those wins and investing intelligently in the winners of tomorrow. And it'll also smarten you up on the rest of your portfolio, right? Because if your other investments aren't AI ready, aren't quantum ready, aren't digital currency and stablecoin, then they're going to be disrupted in very negative ways too. So I think there's a lot of multiplicative positive impacts if we play this game intelligently. So great question.
Agostino, when we were preparing for this, we talked about some of the investments that people were making in the stablecoin environment and in different markets. Not this market, obviously, but what were the things that you felt that needed to be in place to make these kinds of investments? You talked about some of the things that, if you're asking yourself questions, what are the right investments? So why don't you explore that a little bit for us?
I think the major investment in, if one wants to develop like a stablecoin platform, is first of all investment in technology, right? You need to have the technology in place. And when I say technology in place, it doesn't only mean the underlying blockchain who can mint this coin, but also like the capability of managing these assets that you get when you issue or mint a stable coin. Like how do you invest these assets in a way that they really have safety, in a way that you are able to avoid runs, or you are not exposed to the risk that all of a sudden like you don't have enough liquidity when there is a need. And when the customers or the users who has purchased your stable coin comes, right? So that's definitely one important investment, like basically being adapted with the technology. That's what I mentioned, why I mentioned earlier that those who are already in the business of tech, for example, like social media companies or data companies, they might have an advantage over others because they already have the infrastructure in place. That's one investment. Of course, the other investment that I think is important and needs to be considered is also investment in security. Like you want to make sure that you are not subject to breaches or any like form of, let's say, crypto attack, which are like, of course, very popular nowadays. You want to make sure that if you, for example, are minting the stable coins using smart contracts, which is also how some companies operate right now. For example, Maker, the DAI stablecoin, which is one of the stablecoin which is currently issued on the blockchain by a smart contract, it can be subject to, let's say, manipulation, attacks, and so on. And therefore, if one wants to avoid this, then you have to start investing into like formal verification of smart contracts, and it's actually other technological like remedies to avoid that there is basically manipulation and therefore loss of value for the stable coins. So these I think are two major investments in my view. Those who already, those players who have already been in this business for a long time and they already have some technology in place, I think they will have a competitive advantage over others. And I think for a place like Canada, for example, which is still a little bit behind the issuance of stable coins, primarily because they view them as securities, and under this classification, like a securities, in principle, like you shouldn't be able to make payment or shouldn't use them for making payments. I think if you don't basically get up to speed, you might have a risk of losing, being in a competitive disadvantage with other countries, especially because you don't want all the countries to buy, let's say, US issued stable coins. You would like to have some diversification in terms of their portfolios.
So Cameron, I'm going to send this one over to you. How can we support the executive committee to create a strategy on a topic, and I'll say topics, plural, that are so technical? Mandates are important, but who drives this conversation?
Yeah, it's actually a hard one because ultimately you have people that may not be technically adept having to make very technical decisions and investment decisions. And so it still comes back to what problem are you trying to solve, right? What are the organizational goals? It's pretty easy, when you think about use cases, if you take a process, right now most of what happens is you'll take a process and you'll put AI into that process. It's a crappy process, it's still going to be awful at the end, it doesn't change it. So when it comes back to what AI should be doing, AI should actually be supporting your strategy. And so ultimately, when you start digging into that, it's what are you trying to accomplish over the long run? And how does AI actually fit? Right? So we see lots of companies right now, and it's quite bothersome actually, where there's a mandate that the company must adopt AI, so they just get a bunch of co-pilots. That's a start, but it isn't really AI, right? But then they're ticking the box saying we're using AI. And so ultimately, when you come back to it, it's informing, it's having that intersection of senior decision makers, but also being supported in a team environment, right? It's a team sport. So the people that actually do the job, even though they might be quite junior, the people that actually are implementing the technology, like you really have to think about something that's more holistic in terms of that decision making, because they can't be made in a vacuum. These decisions really do have to be made in these are the big things we need to accomplish as an organization. How is AI going to enable that? So I'll give you an example. Predictive analytics are very valuable. They're not AI. But if they're valuable, keep using them. So it's the right tool for the right job. So coming back to what are you trying to accomplish, making sure you have the data available to do that, and then ultimately creating that roadmap and pathway to get there. But it's about talent, it's about infrastructure, it's about data, it's about security, there's lots of pieces. An analogy I would draw is if you think about a board of directors, they tend to be like some of us who are getting up there in age, and ultimately lots of boards are going to have accountants and lawyers on them. They're not practicing law and they're not practicing accounting. You need a capability of being proficient with those skills. Cybersecurity is another one. I would challenge most boards do not have cybersecurity experts on there, but they're actually challenged in terms of being able to say that we have the right controls in place by asking the right questions. I don't think that's any different for senior leadership. Asking the right questions to say, hey, do we have this area under control and how do you know? So anyhow, it's a bit of a rambling answer, but ultimately it's a team sport where you need input from lots of different people to make sure you're doing the right things.
And so how do we develop the talent in the companies to be ready for all of this? Like, you just can't hire it all there. I mean, we saw in the Globe over the weekend, they talked about the amount of AI talent that we've got in Canada and how we're one of the big central hubs for bringing AI talent in. But this is something where you're going to need a lot more than the experts. You need a lot more, I will say, literate employees in these things. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Michele, you want to jump in first?
So University of Waterloo is all about experiential learning, a co-op program, and commercialization and so on. And I think for something like this, because it's really cutting across all the traditional business units. And in any organization, that's where we all don't do very well, typically. And for something this critical, so at one extreme, you kind of have the lone wolf or the tiger team who tries to just do it. At the other end, once maybe things have matured and we kind of know, then you could start to be prescriptive and say, you're going to do this. But none of those are going to work because it's too big and complex for just a small lone wolf or tiger team to take care of it. And we don't know what to dictate from above. So you really need a multidisciplinary, but a multi-departmental or whatever you want to call it, center of excellence. Right? So which is not too big that it gets nothing done. But you gotta, and I sometimes say you gotta lock them in a room. You could try it literally, but you really gotta empower them to form that center of excellence. And they have to have stuff to do now. And it has to be a real KPI that affects their Christmas bonus or whatever in their promotion. And if you have this center of excellence with short and long-term deliverables, and you're kind of tactical about what you're trying to build in the long term, and you have small things in the short term, I think that's the only way I see how to do it in terms of what I'm working in. That's the only way I've seen potentially work.
May I tack onto that a little bit?
Sure.
So I agree with that structure. And so when you think about short-term wins is getting people to buy in, and long-term wins is having that long-term vision. And so we see across hundreds of companies. Our large companies represent $1.5 trillion in revenue and 3.5 or 4 million employees. We have hundreds of small companies too. And what we see the most successful really is a center of excellence, but a hub and spoke model. We have a deep domain expertise, but you also get it into the hands of the people that need to be doing this. So you might find a company, because I know they exist, where you have 100,000 employees and 15 or 20,000 have actually built their own agents. Right? It's that, when I come back to self-determination, I can't stress that enough, that it really comes back to that. How do you actually get the literacy up, because that matters, the comfort up, and then give them the ability to change their world.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask a question here that's touching on a conversation we had earlier, which is about what governments or regulators are doing on these new emerging technologies. And do you think that we're doing enough to either deregulation, and if we look at it around the world, what are the models? What are the models to follow in this area? And Cameron, I'm coming back your way because it said AI right here, so I'm going to ask it to you, and then we'll talk about, because we did talk about regulation in all these areas when we were preparing.
Yeah, so don't do what Europe's doing because they killed innovation. Right? That's the short version of it.
Yeah.
I think just because it's a new technology doesn't mean a bunch of the infrastructure isn't in place already. So when you think about a bunch of the privacy rules that you work with, it's not about the technology, it's how people use the technology. And so ultimately regulation matters, because if you can't, from an investor perspective, if you can't price in risk because you don't know what regulatory environment you work in, there's a problem. If you overregulate it, you kill innovation. So there's some balance in there. So the other piece for Canada specifically is we're a small country. I don't care what anyone says. So if you want a product from a large company, if we make the hurdles too high, we're a tertiary market and they just skip over us. We don't have that opportunity. So ultimately, where there's opportunities to be interoperable with existing methodologies, that really, really matters, or existing rules and regulations. So some degree of standardization, but there's a component of too heavy and you kill it, too loose and bad things happen, so there's something in between. But we do believe, and I'm speaking on behalf of Vector, not just myself, that regulation is important, but it has to be thoughtful, and you really need to do it based on, again, outcomes. What do you want? You want innovation? Regulation should actually encourage innovation.
Yeah, I would say on the topic of managing or cryptographic risk, and there's many different regulators with different roles here, but overall, we're failing. It's not because they're not smart or trying, it's just hard, and the world's moving so fast, but let's just acknowledge we're failing, but we can fix it. It's hard, right? Because they don't want to make the mistakes Cameron's talking about and over-regulate and be prescriptive, right? So it's hard, but there's some market failure. There's some failures I'm seeing, in that they're trying to use the old playbooks, right? There's a new threat. We're going to wait for the solutions to mature, and then the best practices to emerge, and then we're going to require people to follow those best practices. And like, there's those playbooks, but there's a downward spiral if that's all you do. If you're waiting for that day, it's not going to happen until it's too late, because again, hyperspeed, hyperscale. You go to the banks and others, they're not sufficiently creating cryptographic resilience. Number one reason, the regulators, they don't have to, right? So they're not. And one of the things that will motivate them to do it, and partly, the regulators for many reasons, because it's motivation, they don't change their behavior because they see the light, but because they feel the heat. There's heat, but also guidance. Like, they want to do it, some of them. But they're like, but I don't want to do something and then find out later it was my regulator says to do something else. So to be fair, so there's a number of things where regulation, different forms of small r regulation can help, right? But there's a downward spiral, because then the banks and others aren't doing it because they kind of don't have to, and they don't have a clear path, right? And the regulators don't want to require it, because they're like, well, the solutions aren't mature yet. And you go to the vendors and you're like, why the hell aren't the solutions mature yet? They're like, what are you talking about? My customers aren't asking for it. So you see the downward spiral, right? They're not asking for it because they don't have to, because they're not being either directed or encouraged. And they're not doing it because the vendors aren't providing it, and the banks aren't, they're not doing it because the customers aren't asking. And we got to break out of that spiral. So what I've been encouraging regulators to say, there's something in between do nothing and wait and prescribe something that doesn't exist, right? You can start requiring proper assessment and roadmap or something, right? There's an intermediate step between do nothing and have a fully mature, standardized, certified solution. There's at least one intermediate step, but can you think of those one or two and start having those levers? Again, prescriptive regulation and turning this into a compliance thing, that would be a disaster. So I'm not talking, so avoid the stupid stuff, of course. And they're thinking more and more about how to do that. And so some positive things, like OSFI in Canada's actually been doing some really great stuff globally in this direction. For example, OSFI 2-3 years ago started issuing questionnaires to the banks saying, so how are you approaching this quantum thing? That sends a powerful signal that it elevates its importance, right? The Bank of Canada has been convening thought leaders globally in central banks to share what they're currently doing in terms of quantum readiness. This sends a strong signal back to the other central banks that, oh, this is a thing, we have to be doing something. So there's these soft, they didn't regulate a single thing, but they're sending signals and starting, okay, these are really, they're starting to get the ball moving in a positive direction. It's not enough, but I do want to call out the true leadership and the really important first steps we have been seeing. Canada's been one of the top globally, and there's a few other regulators who've been showing some leadership, but we have to go a lot faster now.
It seems to, and I'm going to end with this one question, in order to deal with all of these emerging technologies, that you have to be really nimble and you have to be fast. You can't, but you have to be thoughtful all at the same time. So what are some thoughts on how we balance these three things? Cameron, I start with you. Agostino, you're seeing those technologies, so let's just go through the panel and talk about that. Yeah. Leave that for thoughts for the audience today.
Yeah, so because AI is meant to extract insights out of data. We all heard the stories of people putting things into public systems they shouldn't. So ultimately, you need to start out with privacy by design. You really need to start out and say, this is about data. How do you make sure that your data is secure? In some cases, you air gap things. In some cases, you may use small models. There's all sorts of different ways of dealing with it, but you really need to be starting out as quite thoughtful. The fundamentals of project management, if you're not spending 10% of your time up front figuring out what you're going to do, you're probably not going to succeed. So yes, it is a fast-moving market. You're doing a lot of things that you haven't done before. Mm-hmm. Make sure you go find some expertise, but it really is about experimenting in an environment where you're not going to get into trouble. So you're still going to have some component of really risky things and not risky things. And so how do you actually take an acceptable amount of risk? And I worked as a banker at one point, and I remember sometimes mitigating measures like there are none, and you could accept that if it was the right thing, right? In other ways, it's like, no, we're not prepared to do this. So just being able to actually really lay out, how can we experiment with this in a very safe environment? And that's kind of the starting point, and play with it a lot, right? Interact with it. It's not scary, it's helpful. And so just ensuring that you're not going to have data leakages and people aren't accessing things they shouldn't be accessing. So it really does start out with putting it in a structure that you can then start using many different models and many different methodologies on top of that data infrastructure.
Agostino, looking at things that we don't have here in country, but how do we keep an eye on those technologies and stay nimble?
Yeah, I agree. I think the same questions that were mentioned by Cameron about privacy, for example, that's one of the main obstacles or the main bottlenecks of these new technologies. If we think about, for example, like issuance of digital currency at a nationwide level, like central bank, for example, digital currency, or even stable coins, there is always the question about how much privacy do you guarantee? If you give too much, if you control the privacy too much, that means that you will not be able, maybe you will allow those who want to protect content-sensitive information to be insulated against the risk. But on the other hand, there is also the question that if in the other end, if you give too much, if you are very loose on the provision of privacy, that might basically incentivize those who want to trade cryptocurrency or stable coins to engage in illicit activities and without having any, let's say, control or authority to punish them if something goes wrong. So the way there is this question about, okay, what is the right level of privacy that we want to grant to the users of these technologies? And then there is also the question about safety also, right? How safe are these technologies? How can we guarantee safety? How can we guarantee that these are like resistant to attacks as well as stable? Like if we want to, for example, migrate the entire financial system on a blockchain, this means like a trillion of transactions per second, right? Then we need a lot of scalable infrastructure. We need to be able to avoid like that the system breaks down, because if the system breaks, then it will not be able to support a sequence of transactions. So safety, I would say, is important. Scalability, like control of privacy. And the other aspect that I also want to mention is basically find the right amount of regulations that was in line with what was discussed before. How can you come up with an international like standards that is adopted and agreed upon by the different jurisdictions? Right now, if we think about, again, stable coins being used for transactions, one of the main usage would be, for example, cross-border transactions, where you would presumably avoid a lot of costs when you send stable coin. As opposed to transacting as we do today, where we have to pay a lot of cost when we check the borders. The question is, the main issue is that if we want to really support that, then we need the different jurisdictions to agree on what is a stable coin, what is allowed, what is not. And if we look at the current fragmentation that we have today, we are a little bit far from adopting.
Thanks. Michele, one last thing to add?
Yeah. So, there's this saying, we want it to be fast, cheap, and high quality, and pick 2 out of 3. But I think there's a way to take a lot of pressure off those trade-offs if you follow the standard 80-20 rule that Jim Collins and everyone else says is the secret to all the successful enterprises. And I think it applies to nation states and even individuals. Because if we do, because I think security by design, resilience by design, and so on, they translate into real business value, because it buys you more time if you're more ready. And that early, exploration and building that center of excellence lets you get that higher quality, and cheaper alternative. If we properly embrace that 80-20 rule and include in that 20% preparing for these disruptive technologies. Because we want the positive disruptions, right? Again, we want to score a lot of goals, but disruption's great if you're doing the disrupting, not being disrupted. So you do want to start in a very targeted, focused, strategic way, deciding what you're going to be exploring early on before it's a crisis or a catch-up game.
Perfect. Well, we'll have to leave it there. That's all the time we have to go through this really wide topics. There's so much complexity, but I'd like to thank all 3 of you, Michele, Agostino, Cameron, for helping us make sense of this interconnected web of tech and cyber risks.